This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available now wherever books are sold. Join me here every week as I interview interesting people from all different backgrounds about their paths toward peace with food and their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 255 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with anti-diet social worker Noel Ramirez about the parallels between disordered eating and dysfunctional relationships, the intersection of eating disorders and substance abuse, creating a sense of home in our bodies, bringing health at every size to primary care, and so much more. I can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment, but first, it's time for Ask Food Psych. This week's question is from a listener named Letitia, who writes, "Is there truly such a thing as quote-unquote diet-related illness?" I ask this as someone who works in food justice, where the mission of increasing access to so-called fresh foods is rooted in the idea that someone's diet can lead to or prevent the likelihood of developing certain diseases. As I learn more about diabetes, for example, I'm realizing that genetic predisposition plays a much larger role in whether one develops it rather than their diet. Similarly, I know people in my life who attempted to manage cholesterol levels and hypertension solely by making dietary shifts, only for it to backfire and for them to realize that they need medication. Diet alone wasn't enough. So I would love to know if referring to these quote-unquote diet-related diseases as such is incorrect, and if so, if there are better ways to refer to diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, etc. Thanks. So thanks, Letitia, for that great question. And before I answer, just my usual disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only, aren't a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice, and don't constitute a provider-patient relationship. So this is a really important question, and I'm really glad you asked it. And it sounds like you're already grappling with the fact that, in many cases, the evidence doesn't actually seem to line up with the rhetoric about these diseases. You're so right that the genetic predisposition part plays a huge role in diabetes, and that diabetes can't be quote-unquote cured or prevented with a diet. I talked a bit about that with Lauren Newman in episode 224, which we'll link to in the show notes. But in that episode, she makes this great analogy for eating a restrictive diet to try to manage diabetes. She says that it's like if somebody needs reading glasses, but they choose not to read anything for the rest of their life. It doesn't mean that they've, quote unquote, cured their eyesight. It just means that they're not reading anything, and that's probably going to be inconvenient and frustrating at the very least, if not outright harmful and dangerous, because, you need to be able to read signs and warnings and stuff to stay safe. And in a similar way, trying to majorly restrict your diet for life in order to prevent or treat diabetes is at the very least going to be annoying and inconvenient, and is also likely going to be really harmful because it's going to hurt your relationship with food and often results in a restrict binge pattern, which is what I've seen for so many people who try to prevent and manage diabetes by dieting. Genetics also play a role in issues like high cholesterol and high blood pressure, which I wouldn't actually say are diseases on their own. Any efforts to sort of frame them as diseases on their own, I think, have a lot more to do with pharmaceutical industry influence than anything else. They're both conditions that can be disease risk factors, right? Heart disease, cardiovascular risk factors. But even the status of heart disease risk factors is a little complicated because on their own, high blood pressure, high cholesterol aren't necessarily going to increase your risk of heart disease. In fact, the American Heart Association, which is very diety and conservative when it comes to things around cardiovascular health, and also, by the way, super influenced by the pharmaceutical industry, their page that I was just looking at on high blood pressure, for example, was sponsored by a company that makes a high blood pressure drug. So that tells you something. But even they say that high cholesterol on its own doesn't need to be considered, a risk factor. Like if you have cholesterol over a certain number, now that's not considered automatically bad. It has to be looked at in context with other risk factors like smoking and age and heredity and things like that. But regardless of whether these risk factors are really risk factors on their own or only in combination with other things, you're absolutely right that high cholesterol and high blood pressure are not easily managed by diet alone. And I've seen in my practice and in, my colleagues' practices as well, and through my audience, many people get into very disordered relationships with food in their bodies trying to do that, trying to manage these conditions through diet alone, just like with diabetes and, other diseases. And so this raises a point that I think is really essential to remember when talking about health, which is that truly holistic health includes mental health, right? Includes mental well-being. And we can't say that an intervention is health promoting if it doesn't improve or if it actively detracts from your mental health. And in the case of things like high blood pressure, for example, hypertension, mental health has a significant role to play. People's stress levels can increase their blood pressure significantly. And managing stress management, is actually a really validated way to help bring blood pressure down. Another thing that raises people's blood pressure, by the way, is weight cycling. We've seen there's research showing, and we'll link to this in the show notes, that people who've weight cycled more tend to have higher blood pressure over time than those who've stayed weight stable. And there's theories that weight cycling puts stress on all these major systems of the body, including the cardiovascular system. And that's one of the reasons why weight cycling is an independent risk factor for so many things that tend to get blamed on weight itself, but that are actually better explained by the fact that larger bodied people, higher weight people, tend to have weight cycled more than smaller bodied people. It's also important to keep in mind that the social determinants of health play a huge role in disease, both disease onset and disease outcomes. And I think the idea of social determinants of health is really a natural fit with the food justice movement. If we're talking about food justice that centers and is led by people of color and people from other marginalized backgrounds, not the whitewashed and stigmatizing form of food justice that, comes out of the wellness diet, what I call the wellness diet, which really is the sneaky modern guise of diet culture that pretends to be all about health and wellness, but that is actually just a diet by another name. And the wellness diet was born out of the work of Michael Pollan, Eric Schlosser, Marion Nestle around the turn of the 21st century. And that, unfortunately, is the thinking that permeates a lot of the food justice movement. But that thinking is really at odds with the research on the social determinants of health, which shows that it's, poor health outcomes at the population level are really attributable to things like socioeconomic status, experiences of racism and other forms of discrimination, food and housing insecurity, lack of access to medical care, polluted air and water, a general lack of control over one's life circumstances, all of these things that contribute a lot more to population health outcomes than people's food choices. In fact, a number of studies show that around 70% of population health outcomes are attributable to the social determinants of health, while only 10% are attributable to food and exercise combined. I've said that a lot on the podcast because I think that's a staggering statistic for anyone who is used to the wellness diet rhetoric that makes it out to be that food and exercise and body size are like the be-all, end-all of health. And this research on the social determinants just gives the lie to that idea. And, a funny aside that I've shared on the podcast before is that I learned about the social determinants of health back in graduate school 10 years ago, 11 years ago, whatever. And it made an impact in that I was like, wow, this is a big deal. But it also didn't dissuade me from trying to change how people eat and how they move their body and trying to promote weight loss, because that's what I was doing back then, right? Like most dietitians and most health professionals in general, that was what I was steeped in. So it didn't quite click to me that the research on social determinants of health completely opposed what I was being taught in my other classes and what I was aiming to do with my career. And so that research really has a long, long history. There was a lot of amazing research already at that time. And now 10 years further on, it's even better. There's an even bigger body of literature, of scientific literature, supporting the idea that the social determinants of health are really central to population health outcomes. So we'll link to a couple of those studies in the show notes just for anyone who's curious and reading up more on the social determinants of health. But it's a really interesting body of research unto itself. If you're curious, highly recommend digging in. There is definitely some wellness diet rhetoric, even in some of the research and literature on social determinants of health, because that's how deep diet culture runs in our society. So trigger warning, content warning for if you do decide to look into that research. It is what it is, right? You can't escape diet culture in this society. So bringing it back to food justice then, I'll say that the food justice movement is in a really tough spot right now because in many cases, what goes under the guise of food justice actually has a lot of diet culture and specifically wellness diet culture wrapped up in it. And to date, the case for food justice has really been made on the notion that it'll prevent and quote unquote cure fatness and or prevent and cure disease. And as we've been discussing, those beliefs are really stigmatizing, especially when it comes to beliefs about food justice, quote unquote, curing or preventing fatness, right? Because that is weight stigma. And we know that weight stigma is an independent risk factor for all kinds of harms that get blamed on weight itself. So weight stigma and weight cycling have that in common. But also, stigmatizing food and stigmatizing the way that people eat, in particular foods that they eat, is also a form of social stigma that can have negative repercussions on people's mental health, as we talked about earlier. And so diet culture really is tied up in the food justice movement, but it doesn't have to be. You can talk about food justice as a matter of everyone deserving equal access to all kinds of foods without invoking the notion of quote unquote diet-related diseases, which I agree is a really problematic term because A, it's not always accurate in the cases you mentioned that diabetes and high cholesterol, et cetera, are not necessarily responsive to diet or diet alone, and that they're not necessarily caused by diet. There's a lot of other causes that have nothing to do with how people eat. And especially not at the population level when we look at the social determinants of health as compared to the role that food plays in health. It's just no comparison, right? Social determinants far, far outweigh any role that food plays. And B, even if there were cases where it were accurate to use the phrase diet-related diseases, in my experience, that kind of language just exacerbates diet culture thinking and diet culture beliefs that are already so rampant in our society. And diet culture beliefs really reinforce fat phobia and food phobia. Oftentimes, you don't even have to make explicit the connection between quote unquote healthy foods and weight loss or quote unquote unhealthy foods and weight gain or larger bodies. You don't have to explicitly say that because that connection has already been forged so tightly by diet culture in people's minds that when you think of quote unquote healthy eating, oftentimes you think of weight loss, right? I mean, this podcast is all about challenging all of it, challenging the notion that quote unquote healthy eating has to look a certain way and that it's inevitably going to lead to weight loss and that weight loss equals poor health, right? We're challenging all of that. But I think that in the food justice movement, when you use language like diet-related diseases and healthy eating or unhealthy foods or whatever it might be, that weight stigma and those diet culture beliefs demonizing certain foods and elevating others, all of that gets called up by the language of healthy, unhealthy, good, bad foods, et cetera. And so I don't know exactly what the solution is here for the food justice movement. And so that's where you come in, Letitia, right, as someone who works in food justice. I think it's imperative for the food justice movement to come up with arguments for equal access to food that don't hinge around stigmatizing certain bodies and certain foods, but that center around actual justice, full stop. And I'm not sure what that looks like. And maybe the challenge or part of the challenge here is that in the US especially, because of how much money is tied up in the healthcare industry and pharmaceutical industry lobbying, health arguments hold a lot of sway, whereas justice-based and human rights arguments don't. There's not money behind that, right? So how do we get people to care about everyone having equal access to all foods without making specious and stigmatizing arguments about health and fatness? And I really don't know the answer to that. Those are questions I'm still pondering, and I'll leave you to ponder them too, both Letitia, who asked the question, and everyone else who's listening to this, because I think it's important to think about ways that we can start pushing for equal access to food, which I do think is super important, and just access to food full stop for everyone. Regardless of the kind of food, everyone deserves access to enough food to eat. And how can we do that? How can we push for food security and equal access to food, right? Food justice and an end to food, what's known as food apartheid, while not stigmatizing the very people we're trying to help? That is the question. And that is really a $1 million question, I would say, in this culture that we live in, where diet culture is so entrenched in everything having to do with food and bodies and health. So I hope that helps. I hope it gives you some food for thought. I will be curious to hear anyone's responses to this, especially those who work in the food justice field. And if you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, you can go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want to ask me all of your questions, multiple questions every month for as long as you want, and have me answer them in an exclusive Q&A podcast just for you and fellow participants, you can come join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. There I do that monthly Q&A podcast. I've been doing it for more than 4 years now, and so it's got hundreds of answers to questions that hundreds of other people have asked in the course over the 4.5 years that I've been doing it. So it's really great library of answers and of information, and you get that personal touch of being able to ask me your own questions. You also get the personal connection of being a part of a community forum just for course participants. It's a private forum on my site. It doesn't use Facebook. So you can get daily guidance from me and my team and those hundreds of other great people who are in this course and on the anti-diet path alongside you. The course also has 13 modules of audio and written content to give you the foundation, the fundamentals of intuitive eating. And all of those modules are yours to keep forever. Plus, you get automatic updates anytime I update the course in the future, which I do every year or two just to keep it fresh and keep adding more information and content. So if you're ready to break free from diet culture alongside a great community of other people doing the same, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. And now, without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Noel Ramirez. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
That's such a great question because I feel like my relationship with food was really complicated. On one hand, I come from an immigrant family. My parents both met here in the U.S. and they came to the U.S. From the Philippines. And so there was this sort of scarcity component to food. My mother had a sister who actually died from starvation. And so there was a lot of scarcity and pain. And there was also a lot of curiosity because they didn't really have a lot of access to food in the Philippines. And so we also grew up in this urban poor community. So there was a lot of scarcity in the neighborhood. I remember just hearing these messages growing up, you better eat this, you better finish it, you should feel lucky to have food. And so on one hand, there's this scarcity component that's, informed by trauma. But then the culture that I come from, food, there's this flavor of abundance, right? And so growing up, I remember my family hosting a lot of events. My mother was the oldest of, I think it was 8 siblings. And so she was really the matriarch of the family. And everyone, even though our home was super small, we lived in this like tiny little row home in Jersey City, with no parking. People would come like from all over, find the parking, and they just knew that in my home, both my mother and father were just these great cooks and loved to feed people. There were people who lived in our house when they just came from the Philippines. So there was just always like this abundance of food and this love for food to celebrate each other and to celebrate resilience in different ways. And then, of course, so I'm talking about, scarcity, abundance, but then there's this kind of restricted quality that was part of my relationship growing up. And I think like definitely in my 20s, where it was, you had to eat, but just not too much. And so there was always this, like, whether it was like you didn't want to be perceived as greedy. I definitely remember my mother and father like telling me that, as well as, this idea of not eating too much because then you would have a type of body that was unflattering. A lot of like narratives that was associated with perform well for master, and don't get too unruly. And finally, I would say that, and something that was really remarkable growing up was how food was a form of impingement. Growing up, so we had like my father's brother lived with us for many years. And this was really something that has like lived with me even today. But it was the early 90s. He was diagnosed with HIV and AIDS and was wasting. And I remember growing up and no one wanted to talk about AIDS in my home or HIV. No one wanted to talk about like his queerness and his sexuality. And instead, it was just like food. There was just food to like sort of like cover up the emotions. And I distinctly remember it was very traumatic. I remember I was very young. I was like, I think around like 10, maybe 11. And we would visit my uncle's friends who were all friends with my parents, and in this case, it was really fascinating because on one hand, I was like, oh, they're gay. Like my parents, are they going to be cool with them being gay? But there was such a point of nationalism and identity of being immigrants that bonded them. So this piece didn't get in the way, and they were part of the community in some way. And we went to all of my uncle's friends who were dying from AIDS, their mother's houses. And I distinctly remember seeing food used as like a sort of anesthetic to the pain of talking about their young 20, 30-year-old sons dying from this disease that they didn't have words for and couldn't talk about. So I remember early on during that time, as well as many other traumas, I think growing up, food was this like way to impinge anxiety. It just felt like folks in many sort of dramas, there was always like drama or chismis in Tagalog and food. Like food had to be there in order for these pieces of truth that were silenced to come out. So I remember just growing up with the association of like that food had many functions. It had the functions of making us feel bad, scarcity, this feeling of making us feel happy, abundance, also ashamed with the restriction, and then finally like silent with anxiety and with the impingement.
Wow, that is a lot of roles for food to play. And it sounds like it really did a lot for you in ways. Like it was a coping mechanism in certain ways, not just for you and your family, but for your whole community.
Oh, yeah.
For being able to, and what a scary time too, the AIDS crisis and where people were dying without any real cure or understanding of how to make it stop.
Yeah, it was really, and again, this is even just in my work as a social worker, this was a story that, like the Asian Pacific Islander queer, gay, and bisexual men community, this is not typically a story that one has access to. And I remember just being younger, and it was just a really challenging narrative because, again, there wasn't a lot of models. There were so many different points of intersection around identity. And it was really hard for my uncle, I think, at the time to find community. I mean, he was just in this country for 10, 15 years and was still trying to sort of find his own community. So it was, I think, where there's no words, there's food in Filipino households.
Yeah. I mean, thank God for food then, you
I
know?
know. I was like, really, like, I think when I think back about it, although there's these really challenging emotions and intense emotions associated with it, it has been the thing that has gotten, I think, people, my experience, my community, my family, my friends, it got us through quite a lot. And it was also just a way to put action into a feeling.
That makes so much sense. How did your experience of, or did you have an experience of American diet culture with all of this that was going on in your relationship with food at home? And when did that start to like come into play for you?
Yeah, right. That's a great question. I think like Philippines there's been so much colonization with, Spain, the US, Japan, that like even though I was born in the US, my parents have had that sort of like Western ideals growing up in another country that wasn't even the United States. And so I think some of their body politic was very informed with sort of that rhetoric of not good enough bodies. So growing up, I grew up in a community that was predominantly Latinx, Black, Asian, working class. And so the body politic was interesting. I remember growing up hearing like, it's great to be sexy and thick and like no one wants a bone but a dog. Like I would hear that from some of my friends. And so I remember growing up thinking like, okay, like it's okay to be juicy. It's okay to be this. And then like I think when I was like, right before like puberty and during that like really awkward time in your life where you're like appraising your body and you're like thinking, oh, how do I stand? Like, who am I attracted to? What am I like? Sort of those interest in politics. I think that was when these messages came up, and I really think TV did a lot of damage for me because I would see in my early teens like, okay, this is what it means to be gay. Like I came out when I was 14, 13 years old, and I remember, what was it, in MTV, they had this show called The Real World, and I would be like, all right, there's a gay character. And it was my first access to gay bodies other than like my uncle's, who that was a body that was really scary to actually see. I mean, he was wasting. So the first person I saw in the real world was Pedro Zamora. And there were these other folks who came through the TV screen, and I didn't look like any of them. I had all these like really intense hormonal feelings about like how I was thirsty for dudes. And I was like, where am I in this narrative of gayness and TV? Because I feel like, I'm in my 30s, and I feel like my generation was like really, there was a really strong relationship with TV, and TV really exploded during my adolescence. And so I was like scouring the TV to find like, what does a queer Asian man look like? Like what does that dating politic look like? Because really all I saw were white gay men who were really thin and had like thin bodies. And so right off the bat, I just was like, my body, I'm just not acceptable. Like this body that I had. And, at the time, I think back as an adolescent, and growing up, I always just had like, the language was like husky, like I was like in this like chubby, I like to call it juicy body. And I just remember like the messages growing up, like the clothes, I had to get special clothes. I had to I was always often teased. And so I remember the moment I came out, I was like, it's time. Like it's time. Like I was so hungry to like be in community and be desired. And when I was younger, I grew up right outside of New York. So we would all go to the Christopher Street Pier. And I was always like, I was looking at all these different bodies. And again, very diverse bodies, mostly Black and brown bodies in the Christopher Street Pier. But, right before you get off of the PATH train, you're in the West Village. And I'm seeing like all these like thinner, like athletic bodies. And so again, my access to queer spaces, even though when I made it to the piers, I made it to my like age range, what I saw before that, like, the sort of image that I had was to be buff or athletic, and TV really enforced that. And so I definitely remember high school. Again, I went to a city high school and really like learning how to diet, trying to like figure out how to like get rid of this body. I just wanted to, I often think about it like I felt, and this is so tied to like gender politic and this like bullshit like masculinity and capitalism, but I often remember thinking that in gay male culture, your body was your access to sex. And if your body wasn't desirable, you had no currency. So you couldn't play. And I remember thinking that a lot. And then I got into chat rooms and like the chat rooms was just like promoting like thinner bodies. There was a lot of like no fats, no this, no that. And so there was just like a lot of like fat phobia messages in my consciousness as a teen. And so I think that really began this intense like disordered eating behavior and identity.
That is, I mean, I can totally understand why that would create a sense of urgency around disordered eating too. Like you feel like you're not able to get access to sex and pleasure and connection and the things that you really want, especially as a teen when you're like hungry to explore that stuff. And so dieting felt like an access point to that, it sounds like.
Yeah. And I think so much of it was this quest for worthiness. I grew up, like my father and my mother, and they would say this in some ways or shape or forms, but they would reference themselves as both survivors and like nothings in the world where they had accents and, people like if you're not this, you can't do that. And so there was a lot of already things I remember growing up around worthiness that I was really struggling with. And so when I layer that with this idea of queerness, I remember really being very young and just so desperately wanting to want. I wasn't even in the psychic place to hunger love. I remember that would come later after many years of therapy, but I just wanted people to look and see. I just wanted someone to see me. And it's so hard to do that when you're you're trying to claim space in the queer community, but you don't see where the space is. There isn't any space for you. And so I remember being, I just remember having a lot of trouble with that. I was really protected though in the community. I mean, I grew up in this urban community, and again, my high school, even though I remember my body was fine the way it was. And I actually ended up meeting a few folks because it was a very queer, open high school. Not even just the high school, just the area. I just felt like growing up in a city, folks had a lot of access to queer spaces. And so I felt really fortunate for that I had access. But I never really quite saw me until I went to college. And that was when I really put a lot of effort towards the body politic. So, here I am, I'm in school, it's 80% white. I wanted to fit in. Everybody was talking about being thin in different ways, or I started seeing more bodies that were not mine. And so I went on this really intense quest. And I remember like the restrictive, no carbs, no this, workout here, workout there. And I was a women in gender. The paradox is just the hypocrisy. I was like a women in gender studies major talking about like, oh, the importance of claiming your body's yours. And then here I am having these like really just nasty thoughts about what my body was. And I remember being really sick during that time. And later, like towards the end of college, I ended up becoming a dancer and a bartender at a gay Asian nightclub in New York, which was this really intense experience of both. I mean, I already knew this, but like really seeing post-colonial eroticism at its finest, and yet also finding community in this way. So like, it was a great experience in terms of being able to access community, but really it like confirmed that whole your body is currency. Because quite literally, I was being paid because of how my body looked and how it moved and what people were interested in. And that was a real pivotal moment for me. Because one, it really, I think when it came to my sort of like disordered relationship with food, it really brought it to a new level. and a level that I think was really, really dangerous. And also, I was being rewarded, right? You know what I mean? There were these really a lot of affirmation. I was finally getting what I wanted, right? I wanted to be seen. I wanted to be desired. And here I was in this club where that was part of the menu. You know what I mean? This was what people came to the club for. In a way, it was also incredibly objectifying and problematic, but I think this really speaks to me and maybe some other folks. At that time, I really felt I was only worthy of scraps. You know, I wasn't worthy of like a full meal. And I think like the sort of disordered eating and the relationships I had with my body and my food really embodied that I was only worthy of the scraps. And so it was such a powerful experience. And I remember meeting some really cool people. And what I learned in that experience was that I love story. Like, I love to hear people's stories. There's something that happens when people tell their stories. I think of all the times that my family was telling stories through silence and through food and through other behaviors. And how liberating it was to finally have access to words when, you know, you're at the club, people are drinking, doing whatever they want to do, and they share with you everything. They share with you all these things that you wouldn't share with the lights turned on. And I was really attracted to that. And I was really attracted to also leaving New York behind and starting new and starting a whole new life. And so I moved to Philly in 2007, which was about 13 years ago, and started my process in graduate school. And I wanted to pursue social work because of its grounding in social justice. And that's really how that chapter of my life came through. And in that move to Philadelphia, there was such a recovery, right? Because in Philly, I'm so grateful. At first, I hated Philly, so it was just not my city. And I remember being like, oh, I'm too cool for this. I'm from New York, and just being such a hater. And now that I look back, you know, like, I'm so grateful. It's a city that is half Black, half white. And I remember being like, oh, like, there's not enough like people in the middle. And I really had such a feeling about that. And what I'm most grateful is, again, I have really created some community here, and there are many like Black activists here who really have taught me the politic of being unapologetic. And that was the greatest gift, I think, for my recovery, because it taught me to finally make space in my body, to sort of be embodied in that. And so, yeah, that was sort of like my move towards Philly. Like, I got a different type of community. Like, there was less folk. I mean, obviously, I was now in graduate school. It's just a different circle, right? Like, when all my friends in New York were like circuit boys who, like, we were all obsessed with diet culture, and some folks were really mean and cruel and shallow and in a lot of pain. And so it was my circle there. But here I got to meet just so many really beautiful people that have shown me the power of what it looks like to be at home in your body.
That is fascinating. And it sounds like such an important trajectory from this very kind of objectifying, superficial way of relating to bodies. And, you know, it was meeting a need that you had at the time in some sense to like be seen, but also there wasn't much beneath that. And it sounds like it was pretty, you know, on the surface. And I can so identify when you're talking about like taking the scraps and feeling like you only deserve the scraps. I feel like I went through a long phase in relationships like that myself, where I was just, the like treatment that I accepted from these horrible fucking dudes, like,
yes,
while also disordered, you know, being a disordered eater and like restricting and only giving myself the scraps of food, basically. It's so interesting how those things connect, and then how different is the experience once you like find people who truly see you and who truly care about you and who value you for so much more than just looks or status.
Yeah, it felt like, you know, when you're in that headspace of deserving and undeserving, right? And you're in that headspace of scarcity and that headspace of really the depths of, you know, body negativity, eating disorder, like mindset. It's not enough to just inflict all this harm in your body. Like for me, it was like I needed evidence. Like I needed like really crappy relationships with dudes. I needed like really just problematic dynamics in all parts of my spheres. Like I needed that evidence, and still that was not enough.
Yes. Like you had to constantly prove it to yourself. Oh, I so
Yeah.
identify with that.
It's so fascinating because it really is just what happens when your body is colonized and in these ways, right? There's all these really different, there's these shards of ourselves that are like, please give me dignity. And then there's like these other parts that are like, you suck. Like you're not even, you don't deserve to eat dinner and you don't deserve this. And really when I deconstructed it, I just felt like a stranger in my own home. Like I definitely remember not knowing how to, like, do I ask for this or do I go to the bathroom? Could I look in I mean, it's my own home. And I felt like, diet culture just makes you feel like a stranger in your own home. And it's fraught with anxiety and fear and this constant anxiety around trying to get permission. And so, yeah, I definitely remember that headspace. And I think part of that was I remember experiencing the real lows of that in New York. I mean, I still had some, let's just say, some pretty unflattering experiences in my early times in Philadelphia, but definitely not at the extent that I remember being like my younger self, really in the throes of disordered eating behaviors. I definitely remember seeing that really unfold and take form in relationships and my own dynamic with myself.
Yeah. And it sounds like there was a part of you that was longing to get out of that kind of knew there was something better. And that was, the impetus for the move to Philly was like starting over and trying to get out of some of the toxicity that you had fallen into in New York.
Yeah, I think this sounds so, again, I'm trying to reclaim like this spiritual side that has been taken away from many people in the Philippines or any country that has been ruled by Catholicism. But I really think there was maybe, because my logic would never have like directed me to where I needed to go at the time. I just wasn't there. Like, I really feel like maybe like my ancestors, I often think sometimes like my uncle that comes to me in different ways and like pushes me into these different thought patterns because, or whether that's my own sort of like young person, like asking for like dignity and respect. But there was just like this really intense moment that I remember where I was like, I think I need to do this. Because when you're in that headspace, I remember not feeling like I deserved a chance. And there was, for those who are suffering out there, it really is, it's real. Those thoughts are real. And the hope, and then I guess when I was in graduate school, I mean, even in New York, I had access to therapy, but there are times in therapy when you're not ready and you just do it because you saw it on TV, or maybe you heard that it was a good idea. I could totally relate to that now with even just being a therapist now, but I just wasn't ready. And I was able to access really decent mental health and really I got back on track in creating a home in my body. And that's what really propelled me to start doing work with the stories of the body. So after graduate school, I was working in HIV practice. I was working in a pediatric HIV clinic, and I ran like a drop-in center for LGBT youth. I got my second graduate degree in public health, and I was really just driven and interested in the stories of health, the stories of the body, you know what I mean, and how people live in their body, the story of reclaiming their body after maybe being diagnosed with HIV, or, I started working in addictions in a methadone clinic. And even that story was beautiful. People reclaiming their bodies after finding recovery or not finding recovery and still struggling. So a lot of my work in the last 13 years is so centered on how people find home in their body, that journey of finding home in their body, that journey of being nourished, and also how to decolonize the body in these ways, and how to sort of, when we're in the process of decolonizing, we're rediscovering the importance of connection, the importance of togetherness, and most of all, we're able to really claim space in our own home. And I think that that's been this really beautiful process. I think your podcast has been really critical in like reinforcing this idea that our bodies belong to us, like not the colonial messages of what it needs to be or institutionally what it is. And so more recently, I've now, in the past 5 years, I've been working in integrated healthcare where I'm a behavioral health consultant at a federally qualified health center in primary care. I've worked in a couple of different FQHCs, and it's been a process of, spreading the message around health at every size, really talking about body positivity, because it really, the culture of primary care is so entrenched in just dietculture.gov. I mean, it is like everywhere. I feel like it's like somebody's paying somebody, to say all this. I mean, there's all this interesting discussion and discourse around like diabetes and other chronic health conditions. And again, like a lot of information that is produced by diet culture. And so it's been really cool. Like I'm working in an FQHC now, and I'm really having some profound conversations with providers about the importance of body positivity. And, we're doing a lot of work with medication-assisted treatment in primary care. So we're talking about not only like some serious behavioral health needs and really some serious dissociation from the body. And so how are we gonna, you can't shame someone into wholeness. It doesn't work that way. You can't shame somebody into wellness. And so it's been a really beautiful experience being in that space, like being with folks when they're in the primary care office. I kind of feel like I'm in like right there in the war, like front line, and hopefully creating some space for people to find home in their bodies after being away from it for so long.
How do you find that lands with people when they first hear about it? Because I feel like primary care is such a frontline type of place to work, right? And it's not, people aren't necessarily coming to you because they want health at every size. They're coming to you just for general mental health needs or for specific concerns, but probably not necessarily to do with food and body stuff. Although maybe, I don't know, maybe some of them do come in for eating disorders and things like that.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. So a lot of people are coming in. I mean, it's just their primary care visit. And then there's this random person named me coming into your room, be like, how are you feeling? I'm here to talk to you about all your feelings and your body. And there's been times, really like beautiful moments, especially folks, in larger bodies who've been really just put through the ringer with fat phobia in institutions. And in some cases, it's refreshing when folks see it as refreshing, where I'm like, I'm not really interested in talking about numbers. I'm really interested in talking about how you're feeling in your body and how to sort of create home in your body. And even that language is often even digested very strangely. It's like foreign almost. I want to create home in your body. Some people are really into it. Some people have some resistance for it. You know what I mean? It's a pill that's hard to swallow, that your body is your body, right? And not anyone else's. And so like, it's a mixed bag. There are a lot of folks, especially who start off like the medical appointment. And I hear it because I'm like watching how folks enter, like, when they're getting their vitals. My office used to be right next to the scale. And I felt like I could hear like the confession, right? The moment they step into the scale, oh my goodness, that's a lie. Like, I can't believe this. And those would be the folks I would want, that I would check in with, because to me right away, that feels like some serious body hatred. And also, there's something even about, I share this with people I work with. There's something about the lights of an exam room that are different than the lights of a therapy room. There's so much like reality and truths and non-truths and messages that feel really almost intolerable. So I really see my work, especially when it comes to body positivity, health at every size, as critical to allow folks some dignity in those situations, because many times there isn't. And so a lot of the younger folks are really into it. You know what I mean? When we talk about body positivity, I mentioned certain podcasts like yours that folks should check out, you know what I mean?
Aww.
Especially in talking about just the relationship with food and the relationship with the body, and just creating a new story, a new chapter of the body. And I'm hoping, again, I've gotten some pretty positive feedback. I've gotten some folks who are they just look at me funny, and also what's been really something I've been trying to figure out how to do, because at one point I was working at a federally qualified health center that was focused on folks who were homeless, is like, how do we talk about this when there are these dire psychosocial needs that are in front of the folks that we're working with? How do we create health at every size to be more accessible in these communities? And what does that look like? And so that's been something I've been trying to sort of figure out and try out.
Yeah, it's so important and so needed. I think those are communities that are so forgotten by the medical community and marginalized, and to be able to bring a little, like you said, dignity, just offering dignity, offering respect for people in larger bodies in that situation. And that looks very different, I'm sure, than the traditional sort of primary care experience, or especially than like one-on-one therapy that you do with someone in a private setting.
Yeah.
So it might be just sort of planting seeds, or just a framework of respecting bodies as opposed to really going deep into it.
Yeah, it becomes like one of the things that I will say that communities that really respond to this like embodied health at every size approach, at least in my experience, has been folks who are in like very early and active recovery. And so in one of the programs that I was working with, a lot of folks were just recently coming out of inpatient treatment and were really reestablishing a relationship with food in this and pleasure in this way that I felt like the health at every size, intuitive eating approach really landed well. And there was almost like no pun intended, a hunger for this kind of communication, like how to nourish the body with items and things that sustained life versus not sustained life. And so I found that to be really important, because so much of the intersection with like body positivity, with addiction, I have seen has been just self-care deficits, and that impact in our sort of mental health, and how that precipitates different types of choices that may not honor who we are. And so that's been something that I've been really intrigued with, and also would love to do just more work on.
Yeah, that's so interesting and so needed too, because I think the substance abuse world and recovery world is so focused, in some parts anyway of it, are focused on like abstinence from food, trying to translate that model, which is a valid model for addictions, but it is not a valid model for food. And it creates a lot of problems and harm in people's relationships with food.
I remember that. I was a part of that. And I remember we're talking specifically about a 12-step program that talks about food being like a form of abstinence is part of that. And yeah, I was definitely a part of that community for a minute. And I remember really having some struggles, right? Because it was about like freedom from food, or like food obsession. Like it weaponized something that I thought was vital. You know what I mean? How do you weaponize a life-sustaining tool, and how do we create acceptance versus rejection, which I felt like was what I was craving for. So it touched a couple of old buttons for me, like these ideas of like non-deserving scraps, you could only eat things that looked like this, and that was a real challenge. But I think it's so interesting, again, my experience with the recovery community when we're talking about like substance abuse, there's so much embodied language. And it was the first time I remember specifically working in a methadone clinic, a lot of my folks would talk about like, oh, they look good, they put on weight, or like, oh, you look bad, you're losing weight. And so there was a lot of interesting language around bodies, and it was like the sort of way people communicated different truths, right? Like you don't look great because you're getting real skinny because you're using substances and you're not taking care of yourself. And I just remember a lot of my colleagues at the time, mostly white cis women, including myself too, because I would get a little excited when people would say things like, look at so-and-so, like a counselor, she looked good, like she put on some weight, and like we'll say it to their face. And And I remember this like these really interesting. I remember that being an interesting moment in time because it really was a culture, like two different cultures colliding, right? Like diet cultures of like the folks who were on staff, and sort of the very specific body discourse of folks in recovery and struggling with addiction. And it was so interesting to see the two of those elements combine. And I really think about that. Like again, this idea of how folks really talked about the body, used the body as a communication tool. And there's a lot of embodied roots, I think, in the community of recovery, particularly with substance use, that I think is important and beautiful, actually.
Oh, it's so important. I'm curious how like your own trajectory with coming to health at every size played into, both your work there, because you said you were kind of part of the like abstinence model with food for a minute, and how that also kind of played into your own relationship with food, doing that work and how that might have affected your healing and your relationship with food.
Yeah, I think part of it was there was like a couple of different ways that I came to it. So like I definitely remember, there was a time, I think, gosh, it's such a clear memory too. So like I remember being in like my mid-20s and being like, this is, and again, I grew up in the hood, and so I always had these fantasies about what it meant to be bougie and professional. And so here I am, I'm like I'm super young. I got my master's degree at like 24, and I'm like 26 years old, and I'm in like Barnes and Noble, and I remember being very clear. I was like, this is what it means to be bougie. Like you get a graduate degree, you go to Barnes and Nobles on a Thursday night and sit by and look for books that are about self-improvement. It was such a clear like idea that I thought like this is what it means to be grown. And I remember stumbling upon like the intuitive eating book. And so that was like the first intro. And I remember thinking like, this is garbage. Like, what do you mean you could eat whatever you want? I mean, I was really sick at that point. And like, what do you mean you could just like listen to your body? Like, no one's allowed to do that. And so it was just, I remember not being at the place of readiness for that. And much later, I would meet some medical providers who and again, like super radical people. And I'm going to give them a shout out, Dr. Elliot Goodenough and Rachel Fox, who's a physician assistant, who were these like champions of health at every size in primary care. And were like, we need to get rid of these scales. Like, this is garbage. Like, I can't believe we're like, I don't want to talk to my patients about these things because it's not relevant. And I remember being in community with them at a place I used to work at. And like, just again, like having the connection, like the collegial connection really allowed me to explore and figure out what this world was. And so like, I just started like, I remember the moment that was like, and I remember Elliot confronting me about some of my own ideas about what it meant and what this idea of like being embodied meant. And it made me think a lot. And so I remember finally picking up the intuitive eating book. And it was like this, like almost like this binge of like body positivity. And I would say that the folks who, Linda Bacon, the folks at Intuitive Eating, even your podcast, there was this really cool podcast I was listening to a while ago called Recovery Warriors. And I remember like, the turning point for me, and it was so simple. And again, it's the message I think many of us find in body positivity was you're good. Like you're good. Like you're okay. And you're allowed. Those were like the two things I think when I think back of all the years of like decolonizing the body, like fighting like very intense like colonial messages. That was what I was looking for. Like you're good, you're okay, like you got it. And you're allowed. And like these books, like your podcast included, all this material really, it gave me that tool, and it opened me up to my life. You know what I mean? And so I remember that. I remember distinctly going to the Body Positive conference. I think it was like a week. It was like probably a weekend training. I forget what the folks they're in the Bay Area, and they came over. And I remember we were all lining up for lunch, and I was like, And I was really, again, like these spaces, I have to just say it out loud and name it. Mostly white women. I love everybody involved, you know what I mean? But I can't help but feel out of place. And so I'm there and I'm like, I'm hungry and like, I'm excited for food. And I remember someone was like, did you listen to the last episode of Food Psych? And I was like, yeah. And I just like jumped in and became like a sister with everybody. And so I remember just like really, I remember that moment clearly because I was like, wow, this is like a community of folks. And again, most of my life, I've always kind of stuck out in different ways, but I felt seen. Yeah, so that I remember that being a huge place for me, and now just being active. I'm on the listserv for the Association of Size Diversity, and just being involved in the community. It really has created like a moment for me.
That's amazing. I'm so glad my podcast was part of that for you too. That's really cool.
Oh, totally. Yeah, the stories, the folks that came up, and like just the guests were amazing. But again, I think I just remember when you're in that headspace and you're finally told you're allowed, it just awakens this hunger for dignity and like looking for anything that could nourish that. I remember it was like, I was so starved emotionally. Like we're talking about food, but really it's so much more that we're restricting sometimes when we're in that headspace. And, I just remember just having this hunger for acceptance. And I remember, my relationship had improved at that point. I'm in this long-term relationship now. And
I was just going to ask like how it's affected your relationships to sort of be in that place of feeling like you're enough and feeling like you have dignity and you deserve rather than just feeling like you only get scraps.
Yeah, it's so, I think about like, we're talking about gay and bisexual men and dating. And my goodness, it is like the Hunger Games, but not with food. Like it is just, I remember just the scene of hookup culture and the bar and the clubs and the apps and the this, and it just feels so, I remember, it paired well, it paired very nicely with diet culture, that kind of experience.
And is like driven by diet culture in a way too, right?
Totally.
That sort of like looksism and the way that people shrink themselves to fit the supposed look, the supposed ideal in that space.
Yes. And it is so much about, when I think about the sort of dating scene and the circuit scene and sort of even just like when I talk to folks about it in my work, I often hear just this acting out of like worthiness, right? You know what I mean? That's implicit in these apps that are like these messages in these apps that are so like reductionist and terrible. So I would say that, in terms of dating, I really, again, I like many other folks who probably were in that negative headspace, found partners who embodied the sort of hatred and like nastiness that we had. Again, I was always searching for evidence that I was like a nobody. And I remember taking a break and really doing some of that self-work at the time and making different connections. I was still, behaving in a way that was whatever. I definitely remember still having that, but there was this, I remember there was like, it was almost like a sudden click. And the moment I started loving and honoring and respecting myself and my body, I started making choices and decisions that were based off of love, honor, and respect. And my current partner now, we've been together for 8 years, was a really, it was an interesting time when I met him. And I think an interesting time for him. And I remember that being not that he, he didn't start it. He just happened to get on the train when I was moving towards like love land versus hate land. But I remember really being guided by those values of love, honor, and respect with myself in my relationship with him. And I think there's a part of me that looks, at these photos of when we first started dating, like, which was a while ago, almost a decade. And I'm like, oh, look, there's a different body of mine. Because I think that comes up a lot. I was listening and thinking about like how we were all having these conversations about how our bodies change in general, but in relationships, maybe they do, maybe they don't. And there's still a piece of me that's like, oh, wow, like when I was dating him, I was like really coming out of this disordered mindset of my body and my food, and trying to decolonize, like, this is my body, his body has changed. We have these really interesting conversations about body changes. And I'm just so struck by him because he is somebody who is, has often, has dated a number of folks who are of different body size, and has often been in some ways somewhat neutral to body type. So I've often been really intrigued by that, and I've invited him into the body positivity community, and he's participated in discussions. But it has been, I think, like, the body positive community, in my relationship at least, gave me permission to be in my body from 2012 to where it is now, and to be in a space, in being in a space of love that has no limits, with my body. I think that's something, again, growing up, I was often told, like, not too much, don't be too much, and this is kind of my way of, fighting that colonial soldier that told my ancestor that they were being too much, and trying to reclaim that space. So yeah, I think when it comes to dating, and when it came to dating, there is so much restriction. And I think about these relationships with food that I had, like scarcity, abundance, restriction, impingement. There's no balance. There's no intuition. there was none of that. And I think when I think about, like, the dating experience, especially the hookup culture, there is no balance in that. Sometimes it's a lot of, like, binging and purging. I talk to a lot of folks, especially some of the work that I do with gay and bisexual men, and in relation to the body, we talk a lot about nourishment, and we talk a lot about how to fully nourish oneself. And are some of the sexual encounters, the hookup encounters that folks are doing, or is that fully nourishing the full body? Or is it a sort of like scraps? You know what I mean? In terms of emotional scraps. I think a lot of gay and bisexual men, including myself, really struggle with this idea of worthiness and this fear that no one's going to love them. Like, in the end, they're unlovable. Maybe some folks have had experiences with family. Maybe some folks have had their own sort of traumas around what it means to be queer, gay, or bisexual man in this world. This idea of masculinity, I think, is, at the core of, like, sort of toxic masculinity is this tradition of policing each other's masculinity. And so I see a lot of this in the dating community, like when folks are dating, like being mask or masculine or straight acting. And so there's a lot of, again, paired nicely with diet culture, or is really implicit in diet culture, at least how I see it manifested in gay and bisexual men's community, is this act of policing each other, this act of desire, almost like waving the sort of carrot over the head around desire and an experience. And again, the binge and purge and restriction cycle is often also seen, I think, in the work that I'm doing in sexual acting out behavior, cruising culture, and sort of feeling really dissociated and disembodied, and, sometimes even having sex and not even feeling the pleasure of it, but rather the thrill that someone's holding you, that someone's with you. So there's a real hunger there, a loneliness that I think comes out in different ways. And the diet culture and the acting out towards the body in terms of, like, food restriction and disordered eating, I think is just but one of many cards that is played in some of the pain that a lot of our gay and bisexual men out there are dealing with. At least I could definitely say from my own personal experience has been part of that. But in some of the work that I'm doing, especially the work that I did many years ago and still continue to do with gay and bisexual men who are living with HIV, like this conversation around stigma and the body. So we really, I think, when it comes to anybody that is engaging in a world of, like, masculinity, there is often these just really intense stories of the body. And in my private practice, my hope is that folks feel safe enough to sort of retell the story, help co-write a new story, and to create a sense of home in the body. Because really, like, institutional homophobia, institutional racism, sexism, these are all, like, colonial institutions that have displaced us in our bodies. And part of that decolonization is finding connection with one another, finding that togetherness, and also finding a sense of belonging so that folks could make decisions that honor who we are.
I love that. And I love the sort of emphasis on coming home too, and this idea of feeling at home in your body and feeling worthy of love and connection, because that is what these colonial ideas so rob us of.
I think of, there's this photo of me, and again, this is like, I wish my parents would tell me these things. And it was like me as like a 2-year-old with these like 3 women, old women in my room growing up as a kid. And I was like, whoa, like we're all in the same bed. Like, who are these folks? And they happened to be like in-laws of my parents. And they were like, oh, they lived with us for a little bit. I was like, a little bit? Like, they look like they've been here for a while. And it's like, for like a year and a half or 2 years. And so here I am I grew up in this interesting house where, just like we're talking about coming home to our bodies, right? Like, I grew up in this house where a lot of new immigrants came through this home. And, there's a lot of conflict, right? English, language, and just exploring the land that is not like being a foreigner, the xenophobia, the racism. And yet, in this home, I see this photo and I think of these memories growing up and how my mom and dad would like cook, and like these folks were like, they were at home even though they were scared. And that really, when I think about what it means to be a Filipino American, when I think about what it means to be me in these different intersections and these different layers that both conflict with each other and also work very well with each other, I think of that moment. I think of, I came from a family that created a sense of home for people that felt like strangers who would then find their own home. And I think that's like a powerful element in all of our work when we are able to do that with folks, to create a sense of home in the bodies. And I think for those of us who have really suffered through diet culture and the pain of the many different institutions that drive that, we've been exiled from our home. And I think it's the work that folks are doing in the body positive community, the work that this podcast is doing. Some of the great therapists in Philadelphia, Sonali is one of them I know is in the podcast, and some other folks who are doing some beautiful work in the community. Yeah, it's about finding that home and creating that sense of belonging in a world that makes you feel like you're a stranger, a foreigner.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I love that so much and really appreciate you sharing that and all of your perspective and wisdom. Can you let us know where people can find you online and learn more about your work?
Sure. Yeah. So I have a website. My website is Noel B. Ramirez, NoelBRamirez.com. And if folks want to check me out, I'm there.
I love it. We'll put a link to that in the show notes so people can find you, and so appreciate the work you're doing. Thank you so much for coming on. I feel like this was really important and is going to resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah, and I want to thank you so much for your work. I really, I can't explain how profound it is to be given permission and to hear other folks give permission. And, again, I just say I recommend your podcast to many folks because people are really hungry for the content that you're providing in your podcast. So again, thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. That means a lot. That is so nice to hear. So that is our show. Thanks again so much to Noel Ramirez for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you want some help healing your relationship with food, you can get support from me for free by going to christyharrison.com/strategies. There you can sign up for my email list and get my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need the anti-diet message in their life by sharing this episode and subscribing to the pod on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can see all the places to subscribe at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. And also, I would love it if you could leave a nice rating and review in your podcast provider of choice, which helps new listeners discover the show and is always so appreciated. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, just go to christyharrison.com/255. That's christyharrison.com/255. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode was brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to make peace with food, break free from diet culture, and reclaim the life it stole from you alongside a wonderful community of people on the same path, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. A big thanks, as always, to our editor and sound engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasek, and our transcriptionist, Mycroft Holmes, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Melissa Alam. Our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs, and I'm your host and producer, Christy Harrison. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.